This event is being held by Resource Global, primarily on Nairobi side of Resource Global, together with Northern, who have been an amazing partner for us today. And Northern Seminary wants to just thank you just for joining us in this, as we take time to just hear from Andy about culture shaping. And I want to introduce Tracy, who's a professor from Northern. She's the one who actually has the class from Northern who are joining us today on this webinar. And allow me to give her just a moment to tell us a little bit about herself and the class, and officially welcome the class as well.
Yes, thank you so much. It is great to be joining with so many different organizations and conversations here for I think what is a very important conversation around culture. It is always obviously important to talk about the intersection of culture and our faith and how our faith creates culture. But I think, as the scripture says, for such a time as this, what a timely conversation for the chaos that seems ever present in our culture these days. So on behalf of Northern Seminary, I am so grateful that we get to bring our students into this conversation as they prepare for ministry, and so many of them already serving in ministry. So I get the privilege of serving them at Northern Seminary, and then I also serve as a teaching pastor at a church in Chicago. So that's where I'm at today. But enough about me, and thank you so much for letting us at Northern join you. And anybody from Northern, if you have any questions, just shoot me a question or anything in the chat. I'll be here for the duration of our time. Thank you all so much.
Great, thank you. Resource Global, together with Northern, are committed to resourcing ministry leaders with fantastic teaching, just sound doctrine, and excited to send people into the marketplace who will be able to be relevant in that space. And that's why we're having Andy join us today. Allow me to just take a moment to introduce our speaker and facilitator today, Andy Crouch, who is an author of multiple books, The Turquoise Family, Strong and Weak, Embracing a Life of Love, Playing God, The Redeeming Gift, Redeeming the Gift of Power, and then Culture Making, Recovering Our Creative Calling, and many, many more. He was an executive editor of Christianity Today from 2012 to 2016, and served the John Templeton Foundation as senior strategist for communication in 2017. He serves on the governing boards of Fuller Theological Seminary and the Council for Christian Colleges and University. His work and writing have been featured in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Time. And most importantly, he received a big shout out in Lecrae's single. For those of you who are Lecrae fans and hip hop fans, he received a shout out from Lecrae in his single Nonfiction. And we're happy to have him with us today, just to take time to share with us what he has prepared. Allow me to remind all of us before I hand over to Andy, if you have any questions, we'll be having a time of Q&A towards the end. And if you have any questions, please begin writing them on the chat at any point. As Andy speaks, anything that jumps into your mind, please write them on the chat. Or you can send them directly through the chat to me, and we'll be able to engage with those questions at the end in our Q&A time. But allow me to also remind us to have all of us on mute as we listen to Andy. Welcome very much, Andy. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Mwangi. It is such an honor to be with you all. I love these times that I get with different cohorts connected with Resource Global around the world, and I love the work of Northern Seminary, and it's great to have your class with us as well. I've been asked to speak on the role of Christians in influencing and shaping culture. And Tracy, you're right. Well, I think it's always a fairly timely topic. And the question of what is our part in the human story called culture is such a fundamental question for us. And I want to give us two lenses, two ways of looking at that are both, I think, deeply kind of biblical ways of thinking about this topic. And hopefully that will give us a picture of what we are called to do, each of us, in the different places and circumstances that we're in. And the two lenses are the image of God and the city of God. So I'm going to talk in a moment about the image of God and how that theme plays itself out through all of Scripture and specifically with reference to culture. And then we'll talk about the city of God, this, of course, famous phrase of the North African theologian Augustine, but also a biblical way of conceiving of where history has come from and where it's going. And I think these two give us two different angles on the question of what is our role, specifically as Christians, in what is ultimately a human reality, not just a Christian reality, something we share with every human being who's ever lived, which is the work of culture. So let me start with a definition of that very, very complex word, culture. Terry Eagleton, who's an English writer, has said in one of his books on culture that it's the second most complicated word in the English language. So it's a very complex word. It can mean many different things. But my favorite definition, and it's the definition that I used to anchor my own book, Culture Making, about 12 years ago, comes from a journalist named Ken Myers. And Ken defined culture this way in an interview many years ago now. He said, culture is what we make of the world. Culture is what we make of the world. And I found this such a helpful definition because I can actually remember it and retain it, which I can't always do with the definitions I get from sociology or anthropology, which tend to be longer, more abstract, more academic. But actually this idea that culture is what we make of the world is a very powerful way to think about this complex word, a very simple but powerful way to think about this very complex word, because I didn't give you quite the whole definition. He adds 3 more words: in both senses. Culture is what we make of the world in both senses. So Ken is here playing on a feature of this part of the English language, that when you say you make something of something, you make something of the world, it can either be a very material kind of making that you're talking about, very physical making, you're actually making stuff, or it can be the act of making meaning. What do you make of that? We might ask someone when something confusing or surprising has happened. And in that case, we're asking, what meaning can you assign to this? What meaning can you extract from it, or do you infer in it? And what I love about this definition, culture is what we make of the world in both senses, is that it puts together the two things that culture is fundamentally always about. Culture is always both about material and about meaning. It's about stuff, actual physical stuff, and it's about sense, the sense of the world. And culture is our shared human attempt to make something of this world that we find ourselves in. So let's just think a little more about that for a moment. Just thinking about the material side. So I'm in a room in New York City. You may hear people making something of the world right outside my window here. There's construction going on. You might hear beeping of construction trucks, and people are literally outside my window reshaping the physical landscape of this street, West 45th Street in New York City. They're digging, they're putting pipes in. I don't know what else they're doing. It involves a lot of noise, especially when I'm getting on Zoom. But they're remaking, in the most tangible physical way, their natural environment. And when we look back in the record of human history, and even back prehistorically, before we have written historical record, whenever we find human beings, we find them actually taking the natural resources, we might say, or the created world, and they transform it in various ways. They make weapons, of course, they build fire, they domesticate animals, they cultivate different kinds of crops for food. Human beings, from the very beginning of the human story, are making and remaking their physical environment. And I'm in a space, I'm in a building, right? Which is another level of human making. Architecture is culture. I'm wearing clothing. I actually was wearing a very casual shirt this morning here at New York time. just a t-shirt. And before I got on Zoom, I thought I should probably wear a collared shirt because I thought you would take me more seriously if I were dressed a little differently. And what am I doing? I'm taking a material, piece of literal fabric, and I'm clothing myself with it. But this gets to the other sense, right? That what we make is never just material. It's never just stuff. It's never just physical making. Actually, every time human beings engage in acts of physical making and transformation, they are also trying to make sense. They're trying to infuse the world with meaning and discover the meaning that it feels like the world has. So just as much as culture is about the material, physical making of and remaking using the raw materials that we find around us, it's also always equally as much about the very fundamental question, what does this world mean? We all arrive in this world and we sense that it makes sense, or that it should make sense, or that there is some meaning, maybe some meaning maker. But the sense is not given to us. The meaning's not just explained to us. And culture is this human quest to figure out what it means. 30,000 years ago in the archaeological record, we find in the hills of England, we find human bodies buried. And we can tell even 30,000 years later that they've been painted with a certain kind of ochre, a certain kind of pigment that was painted probably at the time of their death as a way of just kind of shaping this body that was being committed to the ground. And what we have there in these absolutely earliest records of human beings, the earliest evidence of human beings, has no direct practical value. That is, once a human being has died and their body is there, what good is it in a way to paint it or to transform the remains of the human being? But of course, we sense even that early in history that our very, very distant ancestors are trying to make sense of death. What does it mean that human beings pass away and die, and their bodies are still with us, but they are not with us? This is culture. We've been doing it from the very beginning, not just of human history, but of our own lives. We all were born, and if we were what we sometimes call neurotypical human beings, that is, we were born kind of prepared for the normal human life course of development. As soon as we were born, we started making movement with our bodies, making sound with our lungs and our lips. But very quickly we realized that those sounds that we were making could actually have meaning, and that movement had meaning as well. We almost instinctively learned, for example, to hug, right? To reach our arms up and embrace another person. And that's a physical act that has cultural cues and cultural kind of sense. But then we also learn to do it just by making sound. And so the baby will initially just babble, ba, 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 pa, 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 pa. At least in the US context or the English speaking context, one day the baby might be babbling the D sound, da, 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 just making sound. But then suddenly this very important person in the baby's life appears perhaps over the crib and says, "You're saying daddy, you're saying my name." And the baby may not have meant this at all. The baby may have just thought, "I'm just saying da, 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 da." But now the baby realizes, oh, I have a name for this person. I can make sense of this very important person, my father, in my life. This is the breadth of what culture is. When you thought about the title of this time, if it was given to you ahead of time, as it was given to me at least, the role of Christians in influencing and shaping culture, how broadly were we thinking? I would suggest we were not thinking broadly enough. No matter how broadly we're thinking, there's more to culture than we often narrow it down. So we're not just talking about how do Christians influence media, even though, say, the broadcast media are ways that people have arranged the material of the world, the physics of the world, to be able to communicate with one another. We're not just talking about how do you influence, say, the government of a city like the city that I'm in. or how do you influence the arts, are examples of making something of the world. But we're actually asking to be part of this story of making something of the world. I just got a distressing notification from Zoom that says your internet connection is unstable, and it has not been unstable today, but I'm worried that it may be. So I hope one of you will wave at me. Maybe Tracy, you happen to be sticking on top of my Zoom screen. If I break up, please start making alarmed noise waves so that I know to back up. So here's where I want to get into our two lenses, the image of God and the city of God, because I think they give us ways to think about what we've been making of the world from the very beginning. So the image of God. This is, of course, language that we encounter very, very early in the biblical story. When it says in Genesis 1, God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over all the creatures of the earth. And it lists them, those that fly and creep and swim. And this is the first story of creation that's framed specifically in terms on the sixth day of God introducing into the world his image. I would suggest that this is the beginning of culture, the introduction into God's creation of creatures who are not merely creatures, but who bear the image of the Creator. They have an ability to engage with the world around them that's different from their fellow creatures. In one way, we human beings, as we now know in all kinds of ways, in our DNA, in our kind of basic physical composition, in the fact that we are ultimately made of the same elements as the rest of creation, and we return to them. We're dust and we return to dust. But while we're animated by the life-giving Spirit, we have an ability to do something with creation that no other creature seems to have, to make something of it in both senses. Other creatures, of course, do transform their environment, but other creatures don't seem to seek after meaning in the way that we do, or to transform their environment primarily to pursue meaning. And so here we have in Genesis 1, the introduction of culture makers, image bearers, who are specifically told, your job is now to fill the earth. And what are they going to do wherever they go? Well, I think they're going to do two things. They're going to cultivate and they're going to create. These are kind of the two assignments to the primal assignments to image bearers. Cultivate, it shows up in Genesis 1. God put them in the garden this is Genesis 2, to till and keep it. In Genesis 2, God places these image bearers in a garden that God's prepared. And their first job is just to keep the garden good, you could say, to keep the garden flourishing and to find ways to bring out all the possibility of the garden. This is the work of cultivation, and it involves both preserving what's already there. In other words, they don't have to plant the garden initially, but they are going to have to tend it. They're going to have to till it. They're going to have to replant it, perhaps season after season. And their job is going to be to take care of what's there and discover what is possible within it. Now let's pause and think about where God places the image bearers. He places them in a garden, and a garden is culture, not just nature, right? If he had just placed them in the wilderness, the wildness of the newly created world, there might be no culture there, but a garden is a place that's already been cultivated. So I said, when the image bearers are in the story, the culture makers are in the story. But of course, actually, even before they are there, according to Genesis 2, God has been a culture maker. God has made something of his own world. He's made a garden. And a garden is the natural world sort of arranged in such a way that it's, well, as it says in Genesis 2, good for food and a delight to the eyes. That is, it has sort of qualities of usefulness to human beings and qualities of beauty and appeal that just seem worthwhile in and of themselves. And what are the human beings to do? To till it and to keep it. It's already good, let's make it better. But they are also to, I think, go beyond just keeping it, to spreading out. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. They're actually not meant to just stay in the garden. They're meant to move out and fill the earth. And as they do it, they're going to have to create new culture. They're going to have to garden the rest of the world. God planted this one garden, maybe in the Middle East as we conceive it, but they're meant to spread to, the British Isles. They're meant to spread to East Africa. They're meant to spread to Micronesia. And in those different places, gardens are going to have to look different because the same garden won't work in all these different climates, right? And also all kinds of new possibilities will emerge. And then these human beings, these image bearers, are going to be actually creating. And we get a glimpse of this even in Genesis 2. When God brings the animals before this creature who at this point in Genesis 2 is not male or female, just Adam, he's called, the earthling, the one who's made from dust. And Adam's job is to try to find a suitable fellow creature, a suitable fellow image bearer. And it says God brought all the different animals before Adam, and whatever Adam called them, that was its name. So what God is inviting Adam to do is actually to create culture, to create names, language, naming of what he sees before him: a giraffe, a cat, a cockatiel, a rooster. And whatever he names it, it is. God doesn't have a list that he wants the man to memorize. God wants his image bearer to start making something of the world. What is this? How does this orient us towards our daily lives? This is our first calling, to cultivate and create. And hopefully, let's just think about what you've done today. If you're on East Africa time, it's the end of the day for you. And hopefully during this day, you cultivated something. That is, you attended to something that perhaps others had made before you, or that you made earlier, a long time ago, and you just tilled it and kept it. You kept it good. In some ways, I think what's going on outside my window here is some kind of repair of the city's plumbing system, basically. And what I think is happening out there is primarily cultivating. In other words, a group of human beings are working with their hands and with machines and tools to keep the plumbing system of the city good. It's already been put in place, but someone has to till it and keep it. And a lot of work is cultivating work. That's image-bearing work. One of the things I worry about when we talk about shaping and influencing culture is that we tend to jump to the creating part, the innovation part. And innovation is very important in culture and a very important part of our calling as image bearers. But I actually think culture shaping begins with culture keeping. It begins with culture tilling in the agricultural sense of taking care of what's already there. At the same time, so I would ask, today, what did you keep good? To the extent you kept something good today, even if it just means you washed the dishes in your kitchen, and so they're now clean again and can be used again, you actually were participating in the image-bearing role of cultivating the world and not letting it just sort of decay into disorder, but keeping it good. At the same time, I would hope today that there's been some moment in your daily work that has called you to create. That is, you have been given an opportunity to bring something new into the world. Just like when Adam speaks aloud the name of the animal, it's a word that has never been spoken before that Adam came up with, and that's now its name. It's now in the world as something new that can then be handed on as a cultural inheritance to others. What have you gotten to add to the world today? I said actually to Laura and Mwangi and Tracy as we were signing on today that I don't have slides for you today, which I know can be makes learning maybe a little more difficult. And I'm actually happy to follow up with a set of slides. But I decided to use my time to actually create a new way to talk about this subject that I've not tried before. So while I'm drawing on lots of things I've learned over the years as I present to you over these few minutes, that feel like a few minutes to me, but feel like a long time to you, I'm actually creating. I don't want to just give you kind of a rewind or a replay of the way I've taught this before. I want to think about it in a new way because as an image bearer, I want to be creating. So this was how the world was meant to be. It was meant to be full of image bearers, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. as they would multiply, of course, it was meant to be full of cultural diversity, because everywhere they would go, they would find a different environment. They would create new things. In a pre-technological world, they couldn't all communicate, so languages would naturally diversify over time. Human food would diversify over time. Clothing would diversify over time. The kinds of clothing you need to survive and thrive in New York City are different from the kinds you need to some extent to survive in Nairobi, let alone the highlands of Kenya or the steppes of Russia. And so culture would become more and more diverse, more and more varied, more and more suited to each place. And in each place, all the possibility and meaning that is present in the world would be brought to expression. This is how it was meant to be. But there's something about these image bearers that's very crucial. They are very fragile. They're very vulnerable. We are very fragile and very vulnerable. This is represented in the Genesis 2 account, Genesis 2 and 3, by the description of them as naked, though without shame. We are the only creatures that we routinely describe with the word naked, that can be naked. Most other creatures, there is no way for them to be naked. When a baby sheep is born, a lamb is born, we don't really look at it and think, oh, that lamb has been born naked, wait till it puts some clothes on. It's a lamb, it's ready to go, right? There is a thing called the naked mole rat that lives underground and has no hair, and it's pretty strange looking. But really, this is not a normal thing to say of any other creature they're naked. And yet this is something that's really like definitive of human beings. We're actually not enough in the world to be what we're meant to be. And we feel it. We feel incomplete, especially this side of what we call the fall. And so the human beings, the first image bearers, are in the garden, and they have everything they need to bear the image of God. But they're frail, they're naked, they're vulnerable, and they're also free. They're fragile and they're free. And a serpent comes along to play on that sense of vulnerability and limitedness and frailness, and in their freedom to give them the opportunity to make a different kind of image than the one they actually bear. The serpent, of course, tempts them to the tree. And what does the serpent say will happen if the fruit of the tree that they're not supposed to touch or not supposed to eat from is taken? The serpent says, you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. And then the woman says, but if we eat the fruit, we'll die. And the serpent says, you shall not surely die. I think what's going on here is that the serpent is insinuating, is saying that if the human beings use their freedom to eat this fruit, their capacity in the world to make something of the world will expand. You could think of this as their authority will expand. But their sense of vulnerability and frailty and dependence on God, but if we even touch that tree, we'll die, will actually not come to pass. They're not as frail as they think. They can have, and I think this is kind of the key bargain the serpent makes, authority without vulnerability. They can have power without weakness. And this is the key turn in the history of human culture, is the attempt to deal with our frailty by acquiring a kind of culture that gives us control over the world. And the way we do this is to make a new kind of image. We're not satisfied with ourselves, the frail image bearers that we are. Instead, we want to consolidate our power and concentrate our ability to make something of the world without risk, without depending on God, maybe without depending on one another. And what we make in culture to advance this project of addressing our frailty and our fragility is what the Bible calls idols. Idols are false images of God. Idols are a representation of what we think God is like that actually are not a representation of God, because we are the representation of God in the world. But what idols promise us is, in a way, a different and better kind of existence than we think God promises us, a life of authority without vulnerability. This happens to the people of Israel, right? When they are before the mountain and Moses is up on the mountain getting the tablets with the 10 Commandments. And the people of Israel feel so frail and vulnerable in this moment. They can't even see God. God, the real God, can't be seen. They can't even approach God. Only Moses can approach. None of them want to approach God. And so down in the valley with Aaron's leadership, quote unquote, they make these physical, tangible things out of precious metal, out of the gold that they brought out of Egypt. And they say to one another, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the house of Egypt." What are they doing? Well, they're making idols. Why are they doing it? To reduce the sense of frailty, fragility, smallness, weakness before the mighty presence of God that's also unseeable and unseen. If they can have something they can see, make, and hold, they think this will actually be a much safer thing to worship than this sort of unknown God who has been leading us out of Egypt. The second move in culture is to replace image bearing with image making. What we do is we decide we actually are not satisfied being God's image bearers. We're going to make an image of God, and we're going to entrust all of our fears and all of our hopes to that thing. How is this playing out in our world? Well, what are all the things that people trust in, put their trust in order to achieve a sense of control and invulnerability in the face of the fragility of human life? Almost everything gets infected with this. Almost everything becomes something that we turn to kind of insulate ourselves from one another and from God. And when we think about this day and the culture that we participated in, I think we'll find that not all of it led us to feel present to God and present to other people. Much of what we've surrounded ourselves with today, and much of what we've been involved in today, in very direct or very subtle ways, has cut us off from relationship with God and relationship with other people. And yet much of it seems extremely powerful, seems to give us great promise of security, perhaps power, and we've been very tempted to attach ourselves to that thing. When you make the image, instead of bearing the image, you break the image. When you make the image, you break the image. And so the human story is of making images and then taking the actual image bearers, the ones who actually do represent God, and actually breaking them, because the correlate or the follow-on complement of idolatry is injustice. And what injustice is basically a decision to make some people less than human and less than image bearers, to treat other human beings as not bearers of the image of God, often because their vulnerability awakens in us a sense of our own vulnerability, or their frailty makes us fearful of our own frailty. And so we stigmatize certain groups of people in different cultures, certain stages of life sometimes, whether it's the very old. Often in Western culture, the very old are neglected. In some cultures, it's the very young who are neglected. But anyone who's weak or who's just treated in a given cultural context as weak can be stigmatized and treated with injustice, because the world the idols make is one where you never want to be weak and where you actually deflect your own weakness by creating weakness in others so that you can have power. And this is the story of the erasure of God's image. Because if we were living in cultures that actually bore the image of God, we would look at every single human being and realize this person, whatever stage of life, whatever their ability or lack of ability, whatever language they speak, whatever color their skin may appear, this person bears the image. But in fact, we live in cultures that part of what we've made of the world is the decision, no, only a few people really bear the image, and other people really are not worthy of being treated as if they bear the image. And this is the story of idolatry and injustice in a nutshell. So what happens? God steps in God steps in with his own image to restore the true image in the world. In the midst of culture comes the Son of God, the one who fully bears the image of God. He is the image of the invisible God. But he lives out his life with incredible vulnerability, with incredible frailty and fragility. He lives it as an ordinary person. Yes, a person with great power to speak and teach and heal, but also very, very frail compared to the great powers of his time. And then he's treated with total scorn and contempt. He's treated as one of those that the system of injustice says, you do not in any way bear the image. In fact, we're going to flay you and expose you. You're going to be naked, hung on a cross. And we're going to do that to say you have nothing to do with kind of real humanity. And he goes to the death that we all fear. And then he's raised. And what this sets in motion is a story in history of restoring the image, of showing again that there's a way to be a full, true human being with all the vulnerability of being human and also with all the authority that we're meant to have. All right, I have taken a little more time than I planned, so let me just quickly give you the narrative that lays over this image-bearing theme, and then a couple final thoughts, and then I'll stop, and we'll talk for the rest of the time. I'm sorry I went a little longer than I planned on this section. It's never happened to me before, but first time for everything. So let's talk just about the city of God for a moment. Let's actually talk about this progression from the garden where we start to the city. There's two ways to tell the story of a garden to a city in the Bible. The first way is Genesis 3, the sin in the garden, the original sin of wanting to make something of the world that will insulate us from God and protect us from our frailty and vulnerability. And that travels to Genesis 11. So the first garden to the city arc in scripture with culture is from the garden of Genesis 3 to Babel, the city of Genesis 11. And what's the goal in Babel? Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And so let's make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we'll be scattered abroad on the face of the whole earth. The city of Babel is the ultimate attempt to insulate human beings from their vulnerability by banding together, by not spreading out across the world and being scattered the way God had actually commanded, by all speaking one language, and by building this tower that eventually will allow them to go back and forth to the realm of the gods and have kind of godlike power in their city. And in a way, the story of culture is of ever more complex attempts to build systems of idolatry and injustice. I'm speaking to you from New York City. I think of New York City as the absolute convergence of some of the most powerful idols of our world. I think about money in particular, entertainment, and certain kind of uses of entertainment. And there's probably several other major idols that have taken up their residence in this city and control the life and the aspiration of the city. And it's also kind of the nexus or convergence point of vast systems of injustice that privilege a few and exclude many others. And so in some ways, the city is the ultimate attempt to make a world for ourselves, to make culture that denies God and marginalizes God and makes a few of us like God at the expense of making most people less than human. And in a way, that is what it feels like to be in many cities. You can think of the garden as a family-sized culture. It's culture, but it's family-sized. But the city is sort of nation-sized or empire-sized. And it's the attempt to build a whole world in which we can operate independently from God and independent of dependence on each other. I've been reading this book called Seeing Like a State by James Scott, who teaches political science at Yale. And he talks about how the modern world has been exceptional at making itself independent of the vulnerability of human cultures by developing kind of logics and techniques of control that allow especially large modern nations, especially colonial nations, to rule and regularize huge parts of the world in ways that erase the particular cultures and the particular gifts of individuals and individual people. And in a way, this is the cultural story we live in, is the world of cities, the world of tremendous concentrated power, but not power that benefits everyone equally or that benefits the vulnerable. But there is another garden to city story, and you could think of it as Genesis 2 to Revelation 21, because God actually intends a city at the end of history. God intends a city in which every language, tribe, nation, people will be represented, a world in which every image bearer is recognized and honored, and a world in which his own son, the image of the invisible God, is the center of the whole thing. So what God doesn't intend is a return back to the garden. God actually is calling us to move forward to building a city, but a very different kind of city from the imperial city. All right, what does this mean for us? Two things that I think we should not try to do. Actually, let me skip one of them. I'm just going to talk about one. I think what this calls us to do is to think like gardeners and less like modern city planners when we think about our influence on culture. To think more like gardeners, or let me put it another way, and less like generals. The Greek word for general is strategos, and we get from it this word strategic. And it's very easy when we think about influencing culture to think, well, we need a strategy to shape culture. To think like a strategist is to think like a general. It's to think about command, control, and power. But what if our actual work is to always think like gardeners? So a general tries to command a whole field of battle and make grand plans for shaping and reshaping it. A gardener pays attention to what is in front of them, what's at the level of their own household, their own family, the neighborhood that they live in, and tries to make something of it. When Jesus is raised from the dead, does he appear as a general or as a gardener? When he's setting in motion the restoration of his image in the whole world, which he's going to accomplish through his people, the church, does he show up as a general commanding kind of large scale plans for shaping and influencing culture? He actually shows up in a garden to a woman. Her name is Mary. He says her name, and she mistakes him for the gardener. And she's not really making a mistake, because I actually think our role in culture is to garden it. It's to attend to the place right around us where people are making something of the world, where the image is being born, and join them in bearing the image. It's to pay particular attention to the idols right around us. What are the idols like right out your front door? And how we can, and what's the injustice right out your front door? And ask, how can I be part of restoring the image, of confronting the idols, restoring the victims of injustice, and be part of a story that actually reclaims the image of God in the world. There's no way to do that on a massive scale. It has to be done on a gardening scale. And so our job is very simple. It's walk out our door today and figure out what we can cultivate, what we can create, what image has been broken, and what image needs to be restored. That's quite enough for me. By way of presentation, I'm extremely grateful for your patience and would love to have some conversation now.
Andy, Tommy Lee here. It's good seeing you again.
Tommy, it's great to be with you.
Yeah. Hey, I'm going to oversee some of these Q&A here. I have a couple of questions that are coming in. One question is, how do you make culture, Andy, in a post-COVID world?
Oh. Yeah, well, two ways. With a lot more technology and with a lot less. So at least for the moment, I mean, the truly post-COVID world, in a few years, you know, all pandemics, one way or another, the human race acquires an ability to deal with it biologically and socially as well. So we will pass past this as we've passed through and past other pandemics in human history. It's not at this moment even the worst that we've certainly been through, even on a global scale. But at least for the moment, we're living maybe in a mid-COVID world where you either have to be much better at using technology or you actually have to set technology aside and be extremely local. I think we've all been spending a lot of time with the technological side. I would just call attention to the incredible moment we're in where your actual neighbors really matter. And so, and this is where when you think like a general, you think, well, but my neighborhood isn't big enough. Like it's not gonna make enough of a difference. But if you think like the gardener, you realize this is the perfect time to strengthen local bonds within the community I live in or the community that my church or my organization works in, and to actually become super local. So does that make sense? I mean, so one way is to add a whole new technological layer, and that's not a bad thing to do. But the other is actually to set aside the technology and actually do some gardening in a way.
Yeah. There's a follow-up question to that, Andy, is one person writes is, but what if my role at work role in culture needs me to think of culture like a general? Because sometimes it's great that you have laws in place, everything like that, but there are certain places it's mass chaos. If you allow everyone to have freedom, everyone just does what is best. I mean, at what situations
Yes.
do you need to be a general?
Yes. Great question. In some ways, all of us probably on this call have a scope of leadership that that is bigger than a single plot of land, let's say, or a single household. So, so a couple thoughts about that. Probably the most important one is the only way you really, so what a strategist needs to do is think about change, right? The only way you really change culture is through people. And the only way you really effectively shape people is in small enough groups to think like a gardener. So even if you are in charge of a very large organization, you could have tens of thousands of people who are sort of under your command, at least in their work life, let's say. And you might think, well, gosh, surely you need a general at that point. You certainly do need certain kinds of information flow and certain kinds of like patterns that you're trying to replicate in your organization. But the most important thing to do is actually work with a group of between 3 and 12 people and shape how they lead others. And they then go and garden with 3 or 12 people in their own domains. And of course it gets differentiated, and one works on accounting and one works on marketing. And if it's a typical Western organization. But I would just say there's more gardening involved in large scale leadership than you might think. There's more attending to the actual persons that God has given me and the actual idols and systems of injustice that kind of concentrate themselves where we work. And your job as a leader is to figure out, like, what are we trusting in rather than God? How are we not treating persons like persons? How are we neglecting the capacity of image bearers in our system? That's basically what injustice does. It denies and neglects the capacity of some image bearers. And then how can I shape the kind of people who then go out and with a group of 3 to 12 people begin to create and cultivate where they are? So, let me just say one other thing about this, Tommy. It really depends on whether you're trying to, in a sense, recreate Babel, or whether you're trying to actually be part of the renewing work of the people of God. If you're trying to recreate Babel, you have to think like a general. But think about the first Christians, the early church, as it starts to spread through the empire. They think of themselves as the family or the household of God. And their leadership is thought of in kind of family churches. Paul says, you don't have many fathers. I'm your father in Christ, to the Corinthians, right? In other words, they kept the metaphors familial, they kept them relational, even while they could have drawn, the Roman Empire was amazing at large scale administration and strategy, but in its titles for leaders, the early church did not use Roman titles of administration. Instead, they talked about shepherds, the pastors, the pastor, the Latin word for shepherd. They talked about overseeing, episkopos, bishops. They talked about elders, the elder members of a family who have special honor and wisdom. But they didn't talk about, procurators like Pilate was, or centurions, So think like a gardener, even if you're leading a large scale thing, if you want to be part of God's renewal movement.
Yeah. one question, and I'm not surprised you're going to probably get this one over and over again, is this whole idea, an intersection of culture and politics. And
Yep.
I know for those who are listening from Kenya, you guys dealt with your own situation with the presidential election. In a couple of years, you're going to have also to deal with your presidential election. Here in the U.S., we are going to deal with an election in the next couple of weeks. Is politics are one expression of culture, yet it seems today that American evangelicals want to dominate rather than serve as gardeners. And how can we
Yes.
restore balance? And what can you talk about how we interact with culture with the election that's a couple of weeks away?
It's so interesting that, well, for one thing, in an interesting way, this question, in a way, never occurred to the first Christians because they had no voice at all in their leaders. There was, at that time, really no such thing as democracy anywhere in the world. It had been tried briefly in Greece 5 centuries before, but they lived in an empire. Caesar was Caesar. They knew, and Caesar claimed to be God. Caesar was the idol, right, of the whole empire. And the first Christians knew perfectly well that Caesar was not God. But when you read their own letters and their own correspondence with each other, even after the New Testament period, they just are not worrying about what Caesar is doing. And I think it's because they intuitively grasped that Caesar is actually very weak. Caesar seems incredibly powerful because Caesar has armies. But they had met the resurrected Lord Jesus and seen that there was another kind of power in the world that they had come to believe was way more powerful than Caesar's power, because Jesus had been crucified by Caesar, and almost every time the Romans crucified someone, they stayed dead, right? But you didn't crucify ordinary people. You crucified people who represented cultural movements that threatened your empire. You crucified insurrectionists. You crucified revolutionaries. About 80 years after Jesus was crucified, 1,000 slaves were crucified along the Appian Way because of a slave revolt led by a slave named Spartacus. You crucified, the empire crucified people to say, your movement is not going to change our world. One time, it didn't work. After Spartacus and the other slaves were crucified, there was never again a slave revolt in the Roman Empire. It crushed slave revolts. And every other movement whose leader was crucified, that was the end of their movement. But Jesus's movement just gradually, organically, very slowly, but over hundreds of years, in an utterly transformative way, changed the Roman Empire, in spite of the attempt of Caesar to stamp it out. The problem we have today is evangelical Christians in my country feel very fragile. We feel very threatened. We no longer are, the taken for granted cultural consensus no longer agrees with us about many important things. Our institutions are threatened. I feel it very keenly. It's very real. The power of the state could come down, actually almost literally, on every organization that's ever sent me a check for work. Could be rendered inoperable by the power of the American state in the next 10 years. It's very real. And when you feel fragile and frail, you turn to an idol. And what better idol than someone who can wield the power of the state? And this is why evangelicals, some evangelicals, have trusted in politics, because the one thing the state can do is coerce you. It can make you do something you don't want to do. Because the state ultimately reserves to itself the power of legitimate force, the power of force that's seen as legitimate. And this is a snare for Christians, to believe that if we just had our guy wielding power to make people do what they don't want to do, that our interests would be advanced. And we have to repent of it because Caesar is actually very weak. If all you can do is make people do things they don't want to do, and that really ultimately is all government really can do in and of itself, that's a very brittle form of culture making. And the other forms of making culture are so much more powerful in the long run. But does that answer the question? Feel free to press on part of it.
Yeah, it does. Hey, Ashley, let me ask you a follow-up question with that is, I think a lot of times as we engage with culture as Christians, you talk about this whole idea of gardeners, and we try to work in a city that has corruption, that has evil, all of that. Everyone's just doing their own thing, and we've tried the best that we possibly can. is there a time when it's time just to walk away and just say we did the best that we can?
Wow. I don't think so. In that, I think the church, the people of God, are called to like press in, not walk away, even when it's incredibly difficult. Now, yeah, I think we can't capitulate, right? Or withdraw, because we're God's image restorers. And you can bet that corrupt system that bothers you and troubles you is way more damaging for other people who have less power than you do. Because as a Christian, you have power available to you in the power of the Holy Spirit. You have, God is on your side in history in the long run. Now, who knows what's going to happen to you this day if you confront that one corrupt official in that particular moment. You may or may not emerge even with your life, but you're part of God's renewal movement in history. So I don't think we can give up. Now, I mean, is there wisdom about when to confront and how? I mean, Nathan realizes that he's working for a king. This is in 2 Samuel, for one of the Samuels. He realizes he's working for a king who's committed adultery, rape, and murder. And he has to confront the king. And he doesn't go to him and say, you are an adulterer, a rapist, and a murderer. He tells him a story, right, of a guy with one little lamb and a neighbor who has lots of sheep. He's very canny about how he confronts the corruption, but he doesn't withdraw from it once God has revealed it to him. He goes to the king. So this is easy for me to say, perhaps, living comfortably in the United States, but there will be times, have already been times, there will be times when it's time for me also to go to the king who's corrupt and say it.
Got it.
I did actually in an editorial about our current president. I had to say it. I had to say what was true, even though it could cost a lot.
One thing, and I think a lot of times you're a go down. People read your books, they look at culture, everything like that. How do you protect yourself? What are some tips as we engage culture and we build up our community, we build up our church, we build up the city that we live in or our work? There's a temptation to say, wow, we did a great job. There's this temptation to make ourselves just the idol. How do you prevent that? Look at what you're doing. You're working with entrepreneurs. You've written books on culture. What are the things that you do yourself to protect yourself from giving yourself too much credit?
Yeah, from becoming an idol in my own life or others. Many things. Maybe the most fundamental, I think, is Sabbath. So one day a week, one day a week, and then several weeks a year, I turn off everything. And these days it's literally turn it off electronically, turn it off electrically, turn it off. Everything that gives me a sense of significance, provision, status, work, essentially, work that I happen to have had some measure of success in, I turn that all off. Now, it's important to do that just so on Sundays, you can't reach me by email. I'm not reading Twitter or social media, or I'm not, for God knows, I'm not checking the Amazon reviews on my books. I'm detoxing on a weekly basis from whatever it is that kind of places me in the center of significance. And I'm just with my family and those I love and my church family, worshiping God. For me, the more significant thing is I actually do this 2 weeks a year, and I just turn off my email. I go away. I go to another part of the US where no one knows me, where I have no significance per se, and I just rest and recreate and with my family. And then every 6 years, I quit my job. So every 7th year, I take a sabbatical, and I don't work for employers that provide a paid sabbatical. So every 7 year, I resign from my job, and for the better part of a year, I don't do anything public. So I think that rhythm of Sabbath, vacation, you could say, kind of the longer Sabbath in the course of a year, and then sabbatical is really important. And then I would say, I have a few people who I am just who I don't have a choice but to be totally honest with about the state of my life. And they are friends who have known me a long time, and we are actually committed to be friends until we die. And I'm just an image bearer with them. They're the kind of people who are not impressed with anything I may have achieved, and who can ask me really hard questions, and who I know really love me and will speak at my funeral and be my eulogist. So it's a group of 7 men, and we literally call ourselves the eulogists because we want to give the eulogy at one another's funerals. And we also want to be living the kind of life that would be worth a eulogy, that you could give an honest eulogy about. So meeting with those brothers is a pretty important guardrail in my life from whatever measure of power I may have.
Andy, one last question. I know time is running out for you is, what can you do to really be able to raise up the next generation of gardeners? How do we teach and train this next generation to shape culture? What are some of the things that you're seeing? How do we encourage them? How do we come alongside? But at times, how do we speak truth to your life, not in a mean way, but in a way that gives them honest opinions?
Yeah. You know, I would say I might put it this way, and I'm aware of some of the connotations of the word I'll use, but we need master gardeners. Every human being is made to garden, but I actually think every human being was meant to be, in a way, a master gardener. And what's a master gardener? It's just someone who really has mastered the art of caring for the world and seeing the possibilities in the world and bringing them out. And it can be a master vegetable gardener who's really good at food, the useful side, or a great, flower gardener who's really good at the beautiful side. And the reason I say master gardeners is that this requires real discipline. And I think the greatest gift we can give people early in their lives is just the right combination of affirmation that they can create and contribute something to the world. And also, what would the word be? Like pressure to do it better. We live in a world where it's very easy to scale up very shallow things. So with certain kinds of talents, especially those that go really well on video right now, you can have 1 million followers overnight. But that is not really gardening. It's very unlikely it's going to have long-term flourishing influence on the world. And yet most young people, I mean, something like 40% of American young people, their number one aspiration is to be famous on social media. And the thing is that what it takes to be famous on social media is extremely shallow and doesn't involve master gardening. And getting to the point where you are, where you've mastered business accounting, where you've mastered a domain of medicine, a particular specialty of medicine, where you've mastered literature and are able to teach other people literature, and you pick any part of culture, that is really slow, hard work. And it's work that you will not do that well when you first try it. And to sustain what it takes to achieve what we might call mastery requires incredible support and challenge at the same time. So we have to find the people that God's given us in our circles who sense that calling to create, and support them and encourage them, but also challenge them. My son has become a master musician on playing the viola. It's kind of one of his life's callings. And when I would watch his lessons, I have to tell you, it was quite uncomfortable because a good teacher of the viola, the classical instrument, the viola, is really hard. Like they barely at all say, oh, you played that beautifully. Like he would play something and I would think that sounded so good. And the teacher would say, okay, here's what you need to work on. That was really not right. Let's try this again. Challenge, right? To say, yes, you are gardening, but let's make it better gardening. I think we in the church sometimes shy away from this, but it's one of the most powerful things we can do for the next generation is challenge them to get on the long path of mastery of some part of culture so they really can garden and create there.
Andy, thank you very much. Hey, for some of you guys who are on this call, Andy will be back again on November 6th. Actually, we're going to hear you twice. Andy is going to be part of our team. We're going to have a 24-hour global church forum. For those who are in the Central Time, we begin at 9 a.m. Central Time on Friday, November 6th, and we end 9 a.m. in Central Time on Saturday the next day. So Andy will be speaking twice, one in the morning and one in the evening. So Andy, as always, thank you for taking time out.
It's wonderful to be with you all. Thank you so much.
Yep. Hey, Mwangi, before I turn it over to Tracy, I know a lot of times you have a group from Northern Seminary teaching and taking this as a class. Any thoughts on your end, Tracy?
No, I very much appreciate the wisdom. I feel like I'm a Gen Xer, so I still use pen and paper. And I just have a list of all these sort of brilliant one-liners that I think just I need to sit with. And I suspect there's a lot of folks on the call who just kind of picked up these pieces that we need to chew on now and sort of figure out because they made sense. And now I need to understand deeper how and why. And so I know for those of us at Northern that are either ministering to people or very real time in a church context, and we have this little garden plot that we're tending with people. This is such significant material for us because I think the church historically has sometimes trampled on the garden too. And so it's a beautiful reminder of how much growth in life there is. So I don't want to speak for everybody at Northern, but I'm going to do it anyway on behalf of Northern. Thank you for your gift of wisdom and grace to us today.
And Andy, I love the very fact because not only do we have a class in Chicago in the US, or actually I'm not sure where a lot of these guys are taking from the world, but we switch it over to Nairobi and you get a chance to have folks from Nairobi speaking. Mwangi, as we wrap up, because it's evening over at your end, any last words, any last thoughts as I'm going to turn it over to you?
Thank you so much, Andy. That was amazing. And for sure, we're left with so much to go and chew on. We'll be excited to listen to you in November. In a couple of weeks when we're having the Global Church Forum, and hopefully all of you will be able to join us on that. For those in Nairobi, we'll be sending you the details of the times when you can log in for that forum, for you to begin planning to be there for that. But we continue to encourage you to look out for the events. We'll be sending you more details on email, continue to be sending you more ways in which you can engage with our cohorts here in Nairobi and the different activities we have. Thank you all for jumping on the call. We don't want to keep your time too long. You can follow us on our Facebook, Instagram, Resource Global, look for that. Go to the website and you can subscribe to our newsletters just so that you can be getting more information on different webinars like this, different forums like this. We have a podcast where Tommy is always engaging with people like Andy. I think Andy has been there before. Just hearing stories and sharing more nuggets of wisdom that we can always jump on. So hope we can see you in any of those spaces. Thank you very much for joining us. Those in Central Time, good morning and have a lovely day. Those here in East Africa, good night. You can go catch up with your sleep. God bless you all.
Have a good day. See you soon. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.